Hello everyone, welcome to my newest video. It's been a while since my last one. Today I'll be talking in defense of techno-optimism. We are winning the fight against climate change. I'm going to try and convince you of it during this talk. So after a very difficult COP and a whole lot of other political nonsense going on, I think we all need a bit of an injection of optimism. So I've spent October running in local government elections. I got 19% of the vote with explicit climate action policies, including improving walking and riding and stuff that I talked about in my electric car videos. Now, some other people have also thought that we need a bit of cheering up during this time. So Simon Clark made an amazing video, a future documentary, about how we succeed in tackling climate change. Global warming, the century we saved the Earth. So take a look at that one. So even back in 2006, Al Gore said that we had the technology, but we didn't have the political will to use it. But now, in 2023, we really have the technology. And it's better and it's cheaper than the fossil fuel alternatives. There is really no reason that we shouldn't have this energy transition. So today's video is basically roughly 4 parts. We have our introduction part, which I'll try and explain what I mean by techno-optimism. And then we're going to have all the good news, all the good stuff that's happening in renewable energy and energy storage and stuff like that. And then I'm going to talk about the tricky bits, the stuff that we haven't solved yet, the stuff that I'm still optimistic that we can solve. And then the future. What are we going to do in the long term, the medium term and the short term to get climate change front and center? So one of the things I've noticed a lot is the urgency paradox when it comes to climate change. We need to push really hard to get the people that are concerned about climate change but aren't really acting on it yet. We really need to get this group here in the acting level. But when we push harder and harder, more extreme on that, such as saying we've only got X years to go, or things are really bad right now, that sometimes tends to start pushing people from here that are already acting direct actors, or those that are voting, using their vote to vote for parties with good climate change policies, to fall into this final camp, the doomers, which is just as bad as denying it. So this is what we might see in the future as we push harder, where we have way more people concerned, obviously, and as things get worse as far as extreme weather concerns, we have a good chunk that are out there making sure their vote every time goes to a politically active. But what we might risk happening is that we only have a very small sliver of direct actors, particularly as those direct actors are cracked down upon by governments seeking to prevent action on climate change. A good example of that is the kind of laws that we see in many countries now, like the UK, or the dawn raids that I've had in my country on climate change activists. Those kinds of ones are there to try and prevent people from becoming direct actors. So this means that if our extreme rhetoric gets too extreme, we risk having people burn out from being direct actors. We risk people moving straight from politically trying to vote to make sense, and then that voting's not working, and as our rhetoric is sort of falling into this doomer camp, where they decide that there is no chance of help, that it's all going to go terribly wrong. And there's something that many theories of change involve, the so-called 3.5% rule, where we really need 3.5% of direct actors in order to get the political change we really want to see. So if we end up having too many people that fall over into the doomer camp, we might never get that critical mass of direct actors we need in order to affect needed change. So what is techno-optimism? Well, the most basic thing is the optimism that we have the technology to solve the climate crisis. I obviously think I'm right. That's why I made this video, and that's why I think I have the technologists, the engineers, the scientists, the experts on my side about where we are as far as the technology goes. Otherwise I wouldn't be making this video. But you can have very different ideas about how optimistic you are about the techno solutions. And that can be very bad in the doom account. But you can be bad in the other side too, where you think too optimistically about how technological chances that you begin to deny the reality of climate change. Starting over here in our Doomer segment, Guy McPherson is a person at a university that thinks civilization will collapse in 2026. It's all over. Give up right now. Prepare for the worst. He is certainly on the fringe of the fringe. And then we have David Wallace Wells, who wrote a book called The Uninhabitable Earth, who's pushing very strongly on that urgency rhetoric to get action now. But while I haven't read that, I did read Michael Mann's opinions on it in his book New Climate War, where he thought that was too doomerist, pushing too hard on that urgency paradox, and it really did risk losing momentum in climate activism by pushing people into that doom bucket. Now, green socialists and neo-Malthusians would be horrified to be in the same segment as each other, but this is about how optimistic you are about there being technological solutions to climate change, and both of them are quite pessimistic, but they have very different solutions to that problem. Neo-Malthusianism, of course, suggests that there should just be less people, so that we don't use up too much resources, that the Earth can handle our lifestyles. Our green socialism suggests that everyone should share those resources we do have more equally, and that is not technological change that we need, but social, political, and economic change that we need. Although green socialism is very wide and broad, and there are a lot of different views within that umbrella, such as famous eco-anarchist Murray Bookchin is actually quite techno-optimist in his views, but there are others that want to move more to a kind of slightly more primitiveness style green socialism that really takes into account the environment as part of that equality message. Then here in our skeptical segment, where honestly I think most people are, we have degrowth advocates who not necessarily full socialists, but think the whole idea that infinite growth on a finite planet is absurd, and that we should take steps to restrain capitalism so that it doesn't eat through all our resources and we have nothing left. And then we have the general public. I find in my experience the general public is about 10 years behind where the technology is. And keep that in mind because it's going to be important later in the talk, that 10 years mark. They are, I'll believe it when I see it kind of people. That is how most people are, to be honest. And so they tend to be very skeptical of any techno solutions we might have for climate change, which might be part of the reason why it can be quite difficult to getting people to act, because they think they may have to give up too much in order to affect climate change. Also, the general public has many reasons to distrust scientists and experts. Economically, many people are struggling economically. Many people, despite the experts and scientists perhaps putting measures in place to protect lives during the pandemic, also cause a lot of suffering during that process, which allows people to be extra skeptical of experts. Then when we move over to the other side, we have the over-optimistic stuff. So the hydrogen economy, green hydrogen is still very important, and I'll bring that up later when we get to the tricky bits. But the idea that hydrogen is just going to replace hydrocarbons, replace fossil fuels, and then we can just carry on life as before, but just with hydrogen replacing it, is definitely not what's going to happen. It's not how hydrogen is going to be used, in my opinion. And secondly, unconventional nuclear. So conventional nuclear has got a place. It'll be important in certain places where they don't have the renewable energy resources to take advantage of that stuff. But I don't think small modular reactors or thorium reactors are going to come true. They're not going to be ready in time. They're not going to be able to solve this crisis. And maybe they'll be relevant later, but they're not going to be relevant now. Not when we already have the technology to solve the problem. Then we have our greenwashing segment, and so much is going on with carbon capture and storage. Almost every report I read talks about climate capture and storage. It's in the IPCC report, it's in every IEA report, it's in many reports done by governments around the world. But billions of dollars have been poured into it, and I have not seen any results anywhere. So I am quite simply skeptical that carbon capture and storage will ever be useful, especially not at the scales required to keep using fossil fuels. And then there's nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is always 10 years away. Maybe we'll get there eventually, but it's not going to be useful in this energy transition. And then we have some people who are so optimistic to be deniers. We have Michael Schellenberger, who's a very optimistic that climate change isn't that bad and that conventional nuclear is the solution. And while he might not be a climate change denier as such, I think his over-optimism kind of makes it effectively a denier position to say, the end of the world's not coming, don't worry about it. And then we have Bjorn Jongberg, who is a denier in my book, such that he simply wants the developing world to develop as quickly as possible, and that would include using coal and gas the same way that China developed their economy. And then his suggestion is that we just adapt to climate change. And that point is really a denial of just how bad climate change can be and will be, especially for developing countries. The good news! So this net zero roadmap, the global pathway to keep the 1.5 degree goal in reach by the IEA, the International Energy Agency, was published this year, and it was an update to their report in 2021. And they saw a rapid acceleration in the last 2 years in renewable energy, and it's being rolled out throughout the world. And due to this, the IEA now estimates that emissions from energy will peak before 2030, that we are within reach of seeing world climate emissions flatten out. And if all current announcements are fully implemented as far as solar and battery factories, we will meet our 2030 power needs, and fossil fuel demand will drop by 25% in this decade. Both of those will be true. And it also mentions that the electric car market has taken off, but will need to keep growing at that kind of level in order to meet their targets. And very importantly, that I'll remind everyone, there is no need for any new fossil fuel extraction of any kind under this plan. So how is that possible? So here is the International Renewable Energy Agency's levelized cost of electricity numbers. This takes out subsidies and levels out between the costs between countries to give us a kind of snapshot of how it is around the world. Here in this little grey range here is the fossil fuel costs. Unfortunately, I'm covering that with my little avatar here. So the little grey range is the fossil fuel cost range. And we've seen that solar has gone from... So solar PV is the biggest mover. Up here, all the way down to by a long way below fossil fuel costs. 82% cost reduction in just over 10 years. And we see a nice 69% cost reduction for onshore wind, again pushing it well below the fossil fuel cost ranges. And this has been done because of technological improvements, the economies of scale as we get bigger and bigger factories to produce the components, and lower operation and maintenance costs. They've also been very useful in some of these other ones. While geothermal, which is the orange, and hydro, which is the blue here, our costs for them are highly site dependent, so we've seen them go slightly up as all the good sites get used up, and then it becomes more expensive to use. But overall, they've always been cheaper than fossil fuels. But I think the important thing to see from this graph is just how being 10 years behind where the technology is really warps your perception of the cost and capacity of the technology. And I also think that the trends we see here can and will be repeated by all other technologies in the renewable energy space. That's quite optimistic, but I am a techno-optimist. But of course, we need to actually build it, not just have it cheaper. So this graph shows the amount that renewable energy costs when they're less than the lowest fossil fuel generation available. And obviously this is dependent on where you build, so it's quite different depending on where it happens. And we see that, first of all, we've seen a great increase in the amount of renewable energy generation, and it's most of the new generation that's been built. It's rising from 34 gigawatts to 187 gigawatts, about 5.5% increase in 13 years, and it's accelerating. And we've seen there's a bit of a shift change here. So before 2018, we saw that most on wind and solar were actually still more expensive than cheapest fossil fuels. But after 2018, wind and solar became a lot cheaper. It became much cheaper than the fossil fuel alternatives, and obviously we saw this rapid increase. But this increase needs to continue if we want to hit those 2030 targets. So now that RE doesn't need subsidies, a common talking point you get from people, it should still receive it. Because still too much money is going to new fossil fuel projects when we do not need new fossil fuel projects. So we need to push that money over to renewable energy. It's cheaper, it's better in every way. But what if the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine? The curse that's often being given to renewable energy and renewable energy grids. Well, currently the way that grid scale, the solution of course is energy storage. And the way that currently the grid scale energy storage is done primarily by hydropower, that was already in place as ways in many grids around the world, where as we produce too much energy, it pumps water uphill, and then when we need energy, water falls down the hill producing power to catch up. But something that's happened is that lithium battery storage costs have dropped 81% since 2013. Again, we're looking at this 10-year drop, this rapid drop in costs of 10 years. Fortunately, I couldn't find a nice graph to show that off for you, so I have this prediction graph for the prediction of changes in costs by arena, of course, many different technologies. Grid storage battery systems do have different needs than, say, an EV battery system. But because the EV battery system has the existing capacity to produce and the existing capacity to R&D behind it, they are currently advancing together. Now, new materials such as lithium iron phosphate, which I talked about in my cobalt episode, and even sodium ion batteries, have the potential to both lower costs and have properties that are better suited to energy storage than they are for electric cars, primarily in their long lifetimes, and these last a large number of cycles, reducing the cost of operation and maintenance of these energy storage batteries. And finally, there is alternative energy storage systems that have nothing to do with our lithium-ion batteries that we have on our phones and EVs, such as here on this graph we have classic lead-acid battery costs. We have what is called a molten salt battery. These are molten salt batteries. They're used in concentrated solar plants, where basically it's melted by the extreme heat and it stays warm long into the night, allowing to run that concentrated solar plant even during the dark. And then we have our flow batteries. So here we have the zinc bromide flow battery here, and the vanadium-based flow battery here. They have very long lifetimes, mostly based on how good their pumps are, and they can store a lot of energy, just determined by the size of the tanks. And we can see here that vanadium is already within the cost competitive range. So we will see more and more energy storage being added to the grid. We already are seeing it as we go forward. Another thing, of course, that always comes up is how do we get the grid to work when solar and wind doesn't always blow and they're intermittent? I hear a lot of things about needing baseload power. Well, most high renewable energy grids throughout the world that exist are mostly dominated hydropower, such as Norway, such as Costa Rica or Uruguay. But South Australia is an interesting case because it's a grid with 60% solar and wind capacity that can carry a grid fine. Now, obviously, this is all to do with new technology, including the big battery over in South Australia. Now, that big battery is able to pull power in and out, very carefully control the grid, and cause what's called keeping it in sync at 60 hertz by pulling power in and out very quickly. This allows the grid to be stabilized without needing a thermal power plant with its spinning magnets within it. Now, this is complicated. I probably should have a whole video on this. If you want to hear that, put that in the comments and I'll make a whole video on how to build intermittent energy grid. And we also have better computer systems now than when most countries' grids were built. And this involves a lot of weather forecasting. So you can forecast the weather in advance, you can predict how much energy you're going to produce from your wind and solar farms, and you compare in advance whether you're going to need backup, whether you're going to need to take power from a connected grid, the way that South Australia occasionally does. And another way you can control supply and demand. So usually a grid is only about supply control, but a renewable energy grid wants to control both supply and demand. And you can do this with dynamic pricing. Something such as this will, for example, encourage everyone with an EV only to charge overnight, or when there's a lot of solar in the grid, rather than overloading the grid with everyone plugging in after they get home from work. So this very detailed image here really talks about how grids are going to be changing to accommodate decentralized variable renewable energy, where we have machine learning and algorithms going to balance both predicted demand and predicted supply in such a way that we can keep this grid running even though both of those are variable. And it was no longer so centralized. So we can have local areas connected to the grid that will only take or receive power when necessary, but otherwise be separate. We have smaller power lines with integrated storage within that. And one of the things, of course, is that if you overproduce from your solar panels, you can start selling into the grid if it's needed, and everyone is sort of part of the grid as it runs. The final change that I want to talk about is transport. Now, I have a whole video on electric cars, but I'm really going to talk about electric buses here and the 2 and 3 wheelers, because they've actually been a much larger part of the transport energy than electric cars have been at the moment. So China, local governments were encouraged to reduce local air pollution with many incentives to their careers. This led to them looking into doing what they could to reduce emissions by switching over from their diesel buses to electric buses. And we've seen this had the effect of putting hundreds of thousands of electric buses on the roads in just 4 years. And many countries are now following China's lead on this and getting more electric buses, particularly developing countries. And this is a way that's both supported by local, national governments and using the power utilities to be able to make sure not to overload the grid when we're adding electric buses into it. But one of the most interesting things about EV buses that I think is that they're large batteries that are usually government owned or government contracted that could be part of the electrical grid. So since they usually take predictable paths through the city, you usually know just how much energy it's going to use per day, and then you can predict how full its battery needs to be at the start of the day. It can also absorb extra solar energy in the middle of the day when we have too much of it, and then it can be a source of electricity at night. So this is probably one of the best ways to get electrical energy storage onto a grid without having to invest in energy storage directly. The other thing is 2 and 3 wheelers, so electric bikes, mopeds, tuk-tuks, have had a larger impact on reducing oil demand, improving air quality in large megacities and developing countries. There is just a lot more of them than any other type of vehicle, and because they're small and light, they're not using anywhere near as much energy to move a single person than your larger electric SUVs. And some of obviously they're far cheaper to buy, they're more appropriate in cramped cities, and we've seen that some of them were already electric, so we can see here in 2015 that graph already starts here at electric, but many of them were still using lead acid batteries. And then we're seeing this increasing by almost 100 million extra bikes and tuk-tuks, three-wheelers on the roads. And some companies have started using it to get more electric in cities. They're using battery swap technology. Usually these vehicles are only traveling within a city. They don't need very large batteries. Often people driving them don't have a lot of money for the upfront costs, but if they're using it for work, they can pay an ongoing cost to lease a battery through companies such as Gogoro, which is a Taiwanese company that exists within Southeast Asia to supply swappable batteries for electric scooters. Now we move on to the tricky bits. Steel production is responsible for somewhere around 9% of global CO2 emissions specifically. Usually steel is made in a blast furnace using coking coal. So the coal is sort of burnt in limited oxygen to produce carbon monoxide. And that carbon monoxide then reacts with iron oxide, or the iron ore, to remove that oxide to leave behind iron. But because it's also putting carbon into that mixture, you end up with a steel-like substance after this has gone through a blast furnace directly. And then that steel is then treated to get to the right level of carbon that it wants to reach the same level. But there is a second way to make steel, and this is using an electric arc furnace. And this is often used in places where they lack coal, and instead they use natural gas to reduce the iron ore. But that natural gas could be substituted with green hydrogen. So this is where the green hydrogen comes up again, after I talked about it right up early on. So green hydrogen is really useful here in this particular process. So our green hydrogen can be fed into our furnace, and then iron ore goes in here. And then obviously the hydrogen will then react with the oxide within the iron ore to produce iron solid. And then the iron solid is put within an electric arc furnace, which then adds the carbon to the compound. A lot of steel recycling uses electric arc furnaces. So often recycled steel will come into this process here as well. And you can have a mixture of new iron and recycled steel, ending up with a process that is carbon emissions free. And we're seeing that many places are starting to wind this up. So the EU has increased the number of green steel projects from 23 in 2021 to 38 in 2023. And that is quite a jump for only a couple of years. And I expect we will see this continue to rise. We have seen some interest from Japanese and Korean steelmakers to move into this using this process, at least using the natural gas over coal. But there are big limitations in obtaining that green hydrogen for truly green steel, because green hydrogen is really still in its infancy. It's still quite expensive to produce hydrogen that way. So for now, the limitations on green hydrogen is also a limitation of producing green steel. This is something that's going to need to be solved before we can get truly green steel out there and usable. So I'm a chemist by trade, so I know that there are a lot of organic compounds, and a lot of those organic compounds come from oil. In fact, the chemical industry is one of the largest users of oil products, but it doesn't produce that many emissions compared to steel or cement making, which I'll get to next. Because we're not burning all that carbon, a lot of that carbon ends up eventually in the products. The organic chemical industry is built on 77 primary chemicals: ammonia, methanol, ethylene, propylene, benzene, toluene, and mixed xylenes. And from there we can make pretty much anything else. So we know that ammonia can can be produced with green hydrogen, because all it needs is hydrogen and nitrogen from the atmosphere to produce it through the Haber process. So it is really quite the ammonia plants need to start being built, because it's a very important fertilizer as part of that process. So this is really the major use for green hydrogen I see happening. But then we can also make methanol. So methanol can be made from biosources, just like alcohol, or it can be electroconverted from CO2. So that's what's being shown here in this diagram. We add CO2 from some source, then we have our hydrogen, green hydrogen produced here. They are mixed together with electricity to be electroconverted into methanol and remaking water at the end here. Then methanol can be then further converted to pretty much everything else from there. So we have a pathway to making these polymers, to making all the plastic products, all the medicines, all the other chemicals, by going through methanol, by going through green hydrogen, and interestingly, starting from a carbon source, in this case CO2. But this process relies large amounts of electricity and or green hydrogen, as we saw here, and we just don't have them yet. At least not until we build enough renewable energy that electricity costs become so low that it becomes much easier to make these chemicals by electro conversion rather than chemical conversion. And many carbon capture advocates suggest that the CO2 produced by fossil fuel plants might be consumed by the chemical industry. I don't think the chemical industry will ever use as much CO2 as we currently just throw out in the atmosphere. So we might have some CO2 sources from hard to abate processes, one of which I'll get to next. Or we may use it in the kind of collection from waste decomposition or waste products or bioproducts that are being burnt to produce CO2, or to feed them into our chemical conversion system. So ultimately, there is a path to non-petrochemical feedstocks, and many people like to complain that renewable energy is not possible without oil, because, for example, wind blades require epoxy. But we can make these chemicals once we can get a hold of the building blocks from green sources. And finally, in the tricky bit section, we have concrete. And concrete is the second most used substance after water. It's used to build everything in our world, but it has a problem. Portland cement, used in the production of concrete, its production and use accounts for about 7 to 12% of CO2 emissions. So it's produced by putting limestone within a kiln, getting that up to high temperatures in order to convert that limestone into calcium oxide instead of calcium carbonate, which then releases a whole bunch of CO2. And then when that concrete then reacts to form its solid form, it also releases CO2 then as well. There are some options to reduce the amount of CO2 it produces. One example is to use gypsum, which is a calcium sulfide, instead of a calcium carbonate starting chemical, or often called clinker. That's one way to reduce the CO2 produced, but you can't reduce it all the way. A special different form of concrete called pozzolana is actually the type of cement that was used by the Romans. Back then they used volcanic ash, and it produces no CO2 as it's alumina silicate based instead of calcium carbonate based, but cures much slower. So it becomes rock much slower, but then is tougher and is often used in marine situations. Some people are now manufacturing this pozzolana using waste products from coal plants and blast furnaces, which is somewhat ironic considering we're trying to reduce coal plants and blast furnaces. So over time, there'll be less and less waste materials in order to produce cement in this method. So ultimately, cement and concrete made from cement is one of the biggest challenges facing us when it comes to the climate change, climate crisis. So it's something to think about there. So what we're going to do? Well, in the short time, we really need to get the message out there. As I said, most people I talk to get really surprised about how good the technology is. They seem to be about 10 years behind, and some people are paid very well to make sure people stay that way. So we really have to amplify what we know about how to build this system, how good our technology is, how cheap our technology is, how we can make this energy transfer happen without damaging our economy. Be kind to yourself, take rest when you need to, and others in the climate activism community. This is a marathon. We want everyone to stick to it. We don't want everyone to get so stressed out that they have to drop out because climate change is getting weighing so heavily on them that they can't keep going. We want everyone to be there at the end when we win. Call out both doomerism and greenwashing. I see so much doomerism online. I try to make sure to give a little hey, it's alright, we'll get there. And also don't settle for any corporate greenwashing. None of this natural gas is a clean fuel, transition fuel. None of this, we'll just carbon capture and storage. It's not happening. None of that. But despite that, don't immediately jump on people expressing skepticism of new technology. Most of us are skeptical when we first see something new. You sort of want to talk through what their concerns are. Are they to work out if they truly are just skeptical of the technology, or if they are hiding more denier thoughts, and have answers. When someone asks you a question and you don't know the answer to, first thing you say is I don't know, and the second thing you do is find out. What are we doing in the medium term? Well, having technology is not enough. As much as I've been very optimistic about the technology, so far it's really only looking like it's going to cause a slowdown in the emissions, and not the turning around of emissions and heading back down that we really need to see. So we need to organise. You organise yourself, organise your friends, join existing groups, find out who's in your local area, and get out there. Win elections. Well, first go into elections, then hopefully start to win them as you get more and more experience. Local, state, and national levels. Now when I say win, I don't necessarily mean take control of the government yet. I mean get in seats where there are a lot of people that are really concerned about climate change. Maybe there's a lot of young people in the area. Maybe there's people with young families that really are concerned about climate change. Get out there, show how it can be done, get people elected. We really need people in general, and politicians and also finance guys, to come into alignment to where the technology actually is. Too much money is going to fossil fuel investment, and a lot of that is going there not just because they want money now, but some of them really seem to not think that the renewable energy will ever work when it's already working. We've got to build renewable energy. That's what needs to be done between now and 2030, as much renewable energy as possible. So get out there and fight. In the long term, well, in the long term we're going to win now, aren't we? We must convert or take over governments. We have to electrify everything to phase out fossil fuels. We have to solve those tricky bits still. Now, a lot of people will say that those tricky bits mean we can't swap over at all. Do the easy stuff first. Get as far as we can, and then solve the tricky bits. And I'm pretty confident that we will. I'm pretty confident in the economics being on our favour. All we need is to change political and social changes needed to get the climate crisis fixed. Thank you for listening to my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Give me a like if you did. If you want to see that video about how renewable energy grids work, put a comment below. Thank you for listening.